Chapter 24 of Elsie's Motherhood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Elsie's Motherhood by Martha FINLEY. Chapter 24. The trees did bud and early blossoms bear, and all the choir of birds did sweetly sing, and told that garden's pleasures in their carolling. Spenser's Fairy Queen. Nothing could be lovelier than was Viamede as they found it on their arrival. The children, one and all, were in an ecstasy of delight over the orange orchard with its wealth of golden fruit, glossy leaves, and delicate blossoms, the velvety lawn with its magnificent shade trees, the variety and profusion of beautiful flowers, and the spacious lordly mansion. They ran hither and thither, jumping, dancing, clapping their hands, and calling to each other with shouts of glee. The pleasure and admiration of the older people were scarcely less, though shown after a soberer fashion. But no check was put upon the demonstrations of joy of the younger ones. They were allowed to gambol, frolic, and play, and to feast themselves upon the luscious fruit to their heart's content. Nor was the gladness all on the side of the new arrivals. To the old house servants, many of whom still remained, the coming of their beloved young mistress and her children had been an event looked forward to with longing for years. They wept for joy as they gathered about her, kissed her hand, and clasped her little ones in their hand, fondling them and calling them by every endearing name known to the negro vocabulary. And their children, having heard a great deal, both from mamma and mammy, about these old people and their love and loyalty to the family, were neither surprised nor displeased, but quite ready to receive and return the affection lavished upon them. The party from Lansdale arrived only a few days after the others, and were welcomed with great rejoicings, in which even Bruno must have a share. He jumped and gambolled about Harry and May, tried to kiss the babies, and finally put his nose into Aunt Wealthy's lap, saying, "You're an old leddy, ma'am, and I'm glad you've come." "Ah," she answered, patting his head and laughing her low, sweet, silvery laugh, "you betray your Scotch accent, my fine fellow, and I'm too old a chaff to be caught with a bird." Mr. Mason was still chaplain at Viamede, and with his wife and children occupied a pretty and commodious cottage that had been built on the estate expressly for their use. When he and Mr. Daly met, they instantly and delightedly recognized each other as former classmates and intimate friends, and the Dalys, by urgent invitation, took up their abode for the winter in the cottage, but Mr. and Mrs. Travilla were careful that it should still be entirely at their expense. A suite of apartments in the mansion was appropriated to each of the other families, and it was unanimously agreed that each should feel at perfect liberty to withdraw into the privacy of these, having their meals served to them there, if they so desired, or at their pleasure to mingle with the others in the breakfast parlour, dining room, drawing rooms, library, etc. The first fortnight was made a complete holiday to all, the days being filled up with games, walks, rides, drives, and excursions by land and water. In consequence of the changes occasioned by the war, they found but little society in the neighbourhood now, yet scarcely missed it, having so much within themselves. But at length even the children began to grow somewhat weary of constant play. Harry Duncan and Horace Jr. announced their speedy departure to attend to business, and the other adults of the party felt that it was time to take up again the ordinary duties of life. Mr. Daly, anxious to make some return for the kindness shown him, offered to act as tutor to all the children who were old enough for school duties. But Rosie put her arms around her father's neck, and looking beseechingly into his eyes, said she preferred her old tutor, at which he smiled, and stroking her hair, said that she should keep him then, for he would be quite as loath to give up his pupil; and Elsie's children, clinging about her, entreated that their lessons might still be said to mamma. "So they shall, my darling," she answered, "for mamma loves to teach you." The young Carringtons, too, and their mother preferred the old way. So Mr. Daly's kind offer was declined with thanks, and perhaps he was not sorry, being weak and languid, and in no danger of suffering from ennui, with horses to ride, and plenty of books at hand. A schoolroom was prepared, but only the Travillas occupied it. Sophie preferred to use her dressing room, and Rosie studying in her own room, and reciting to her papa in his or the library. Elsie expected her children to find it a little hard to go back to the old routine, but it was not so. They came to her with bright happy faces, were quiet and diligent, and when the recitations were over, gathered about her for a little chat before returning to their play. "Mamma," said Eddie, "We've had a nice long holiday, and it's really pleasant to get back to lessons again." "So it is," said Vi. "Don't you think so, Elsie?" "Yes, indeed. Nice to get back to our books. But we've had lessons almost every day. Grandpa and Papa and Mamma teaching us so much about the birds, insects, and all sorts of living things, and the flowers and plants, trees, stones, and oh, I don't know how many things that are different here from what we have at home." "At home? Why, this is home, isn't it, Mamma?" exclaimed Eddie. "Yes, my son, one of our homes." "Yes, and so beautiful," said Vi. "But Iron appears the homiest to me." "Does it, darling?" asked Mamma, giving her a smile and a kiss. "Yes, Mamma, and I love Iron dearly. Viamede most as well, though, because you were born here, and your dear Mamma." "And because that dear grandma is buried here," remarked her sister, "and because of all those dear graves. Mamma, I do like those lessons they were speaking of, and so do Eddie and Vi, but Herbert and Meta and Harry don't. They say they think them very stupid and dull." "I'm glad, my children, that you love knowledge," their mother said, "because it is useful. The more knowledge we have, the more good we can do if we will. And then it is a lasting pleasure. God's works are so wonderful that we can never learn all about them while we live in this world, and I suppose throughout the endless ages of eternity we shall be ever learning, yet always finding still more to learn." "Mamma, how pleasant that will be," said Elsie thoughtfully. "And oh, Mamma," cried Vi, "that reminds me that we've been out of doors most all the daytimes and haven't seen Grandma's playroom and things yet. Won't you show them to us?" "Yes, we will go now." "Me too, Mamma?" asked Harold. "Yes, all of you come. I want you all to see everything that I have that once belonged to my dear mother." "Aunt Rosie wants to see them too," said Vi. "And Herbert and Meta and the others," added Elsie. "They shall see them afterward. I want no one but my own little children now," replied Mamma, taking Harold's hand and leading the way. She led them to the room, a large and very pleasant one, light and airy, where the flowers were blooming and birds singing, vines trailing over and about the windows, lovely pictures on the walls, cosy chairs and couches, work tables well supplied with all the implements for sewing, others suited for drawing, writing, or cutting upon, standing here and there. Quantities of books, games and toys, nothing seemed to have been forgotten that could give pleasant employment for their leisure hours or to minister to their amusement. There was a burst of united exclamations of wondering delight from the children as the door was thrown open and they entered. Now they understood why Mamma had put them off when several times they had asked to be brought to this room. She was having it fitted up in a way to give them a joyful surprise. "Do you like it, my darlings?" she asked with a pleasant smile. "Oh, yes, 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 indeed!" they cried, jumping, dancing, and clapping their hands. "Dear, dear Mamma, how good you are to us!" and they nearly smothered her with caresses. Releasing herself, she opened another door leading into a adjoining room, which to Eddie's increased delight was fitted up as a workroom for boys, with every sort of tool used by carpenters and cabinet makers. He had such at Iron, and was somewhat acquainted with their use. "Oh, what nice times Herbert and Harry and I shall have!" he exclaimed. "What pretty things we'll make! Mamma, I don't know how to thank you and my dear father," he added, catching her hand and pressing it to his lips with passionate affection. "Be good and obedient to us, kind and affectionate to your brothers, sisters, and playmates," she said, stroking his hair. "That is the kind of thanks we want, my boy. We have no greater joy than to see our children good and happy." "If we don't be, it's just our own fault, and we're ever so wicked and bad," cried Vi vehemently. Mamma smiled at a little girl's impetuosity, and then in grave tender tones said, "And is there not some one else more deserving of love and thanks than even Mamma and Papa?" "God, our kind Heavenly Father," murmured little Elsie, happy grateful tears shining in her soft eyes. "Yes, it is from his kind hand all our blessings come." "I love God," said Harold. "So does Frank. Mamma, can Frank come up here to play with me?" "Yes, indeed. Frank is a dear good little boy, and I like to have you together." Mamma unlocked the door of a large light closet as she spoke, and the children, looking eagerly in, saw that its shelves were filled with beautiful toys. "Grandma's thing," they said softly. "Yes, these are what my dear mother played with when she was a little girl like Elsie and Vi," said Mamma. "You may look at them." There was a large baby house, beautifully furnished. There were many dolls of various sizes, and little chests and trunks full of nicely made clothes for them to wear. Night clothes, morning wrappers, gay silks and lovely white dresses, bonnets and hats, shoes and stockings too, and ribbons and laces for the lady dolls. And for the gentlemen, coats, hats, vests, cravats, and everything that real grown-up men wear. And for the baby dolls there were many suits of beautiful baby clothes, and all made so they could be easily taken off and put on again. There were cradles to rock the babies in, and coaches for them to ride in. There were dinner and tea sets of the finest china and of solid silver, indeed almost anything in the shape of toys that the childish heart could desire. The lonely little girl had not lacked for any pleasure that money could procure, but she had hungered for the best earthly gift, the love of father, mother, brothers and sisters, which can be neither bought nor sold. The children examined all these things with intense interest and a sort of wondering awe, then begged their mother to tell them again about "dear grandma." They had heard the story, all that mamma and mammy could tell, many times, but it never lost its charm. "Yes, dears, I will. I love to think and speak of her," Elsie said, sitting down in a low chair while they gathered closely around her, the older two one on each side, the others leaning upon her lap. "Mamma, it is a sad story, but I love it," little Elsie said, drawing a deep sigh as the tale came to an end. "Yes, poor little girl, playing up here all alone," said Eddie. "Except mammy," corrected Vi. "Yes, with mammy to love her, take care of her, but no brother or sister to play with, and no dear mamma or papa like ours." "Yes, poor dear grandma," sighed little Elsie. "And it was almost as hard for you, mamma, when you were a little girl. Didn't you feel very sad?" "Ah, daughter, had Jesus to love me and help me in all my childish griefs and troubles," the mother answered with a glad smile, "and mammy to hug and kiss and love me just as she does you." "But oh, didn't you want your mamma and papa?" "Yes, sorely, sorely at times, but I think no little child could be happier than I was when at last my dear father came home and I found that he loved me dearly." "Ah, I am so glad, so thankful that my darlings have never suffered for lack of love." "I too, mamma, and I, and I," they exclaimed, clinging about her and loading her with caresses. "Hark," she said, "I hear your dear grandpa's step, and there he is knocking at the door." Eddie ran to open it. "Ah, I thought I should find you here, daughter," Mr. Dinsmore said, coming in. "I too want to see these things. It is long since I looked at them." She gave him a pleased look and smile, and stepping to the closet, he stood for some moments silently gazing upon its treasures. "You do well to preserve them with care as mementos of your mother," he remarked, coming back and seating himself by her side. "Oh, grandpa, you could tell us more about her, and dear mamma too, when she was a little girl," said little Elsie, seating herself upon his knee, twining her arms about his neck and looking coaxingly into his face. "Ah, what a dear little girl your mamma was at your age," he said, stroking her hair and gazing fondly first at her and then at her mother. "The very joy of my heart and delight of my eyes, though not dearer than she is now." Elsie returned the loving glance and smile, while her namesake daughter remarked, "Mamma couldn't be nicer or sweeter than she is now. Nobody could." "No, no, indeed," chimed in the rest of the little flock. "Grandpa, please tell the story. You never did tell it to us." "No," he said, half sighing, "but you shall have it now." Then went on to relate how he had first met their mother's mother, then a very beautiful girl of 15. An acquaintance took him to call upon a young lady friend of his, to whom Elsie Grayson was paying a visit, and the two were in the drawing room together when the young man entered. "What did you think the first minute you saw her, grandpa?" asked Eddie. "That she had the sweetest, most beautiful face and perfect form I had ever laid eyes on, and that I would give all I was worth to have her for my own." "Love at first sight," his daughter remarked with a smile, "and it was mutual." "Yes, she told me afterward that she had loved me from the first, though the longer I live the more I wonder that it should have been so, for I was a wild, wayward youth. But she, poor thing, had none to love and cherish her but her mammy." "Grandpa, I think her very nice," put in Vi, leaning on his knee and gazing affectionately into his face. "I'm glad you do," he said, patting her soft round cheek. "But to go on with my story, I could not keep away from my charmer, and for the next few weeks we saw each other daily. I asked her to be my own little wife, and she consented. Then one early morning we went to a church and were married, no one being present except the minister, the sexton, and her friend and mine, who were engaged to each other, and her faithful mammy. Her guardian was away in a distant city and knew nothing about the matter. He was taken sick there and did not return for 3 months, and during that time Elsie and I lived together in a house she owned in New Orleans. We thought that now we were safely married no one could ever separate us, and we were very, very happy. But one evening her guardian came suddenly upon us as we sat together in her boudoir, and in a great passion ordered me out of the house. Elsie was terribly frightened, and I said, 'I will go to-night for peace sake, but Elsie is my wife, and to-morrow I shall come and claim her as such, and I think you'll find I have the law on my side.' Elsie clung to me and wept bitterly, but I comforted her with the assurance that the parting was only for a few hours." Mr. Dinsmore's voice faltered. He paused a moment, and then went on in tones husky with emotion. "We never saw each other again." When I went back in the morning the house was closed and quite deserted, not even a servant in it, and I knew not where to look for my lost wife. I went back to my hotel, and there found my father waiting for me in my room. He was very angry about my marriage, the news of which had brought him from home. He made me go back with him at once, and sent me north to college. I heard nothing of my wife for months, and then only that she was dead, and had left me a little daughter." "And that was our mamma!" cried the children, once more crowding about her to lavish caresses upon her. They thanked their grandfather for his story, and Vi, looking in at the closet door again, said in her most coaxing tones, "Mamma, I should so like to play a little with some of those lovely things, and I would be very careful not to spoil them." "Not now, daughter, though perhaps I may allow it some day when you're older. But see here, will not these do quite as well?" And rising, Mrs. Travilla opened the door of another closet, displaying to the children's delighted eyes other toys as fine and in as great profusion and variety as those she considered sacred to her mother's memory. "Oh yes, yes, mamma, how lovely, how kind you are! Are they for us?" he exclaimed in joyous tones. "Yes," she said, "I bought them for you while we were in New Orleans, and you shall play with them whenever you like. And now we will lock the doors and go down to dress for dinner. The first bell is ringing." After dinner the playroom and the contents of the two closets were shown to Mrs. Dinsmore, Rosie, and the Carringtons, and then Mrs. Travilla locked the door of the one that held the treasured relics of her departed mother, and carried away the key. After dinner the playroom and the contents of the two closets were shown to Mrs. Dinsmore, Rosie, and the Carringtons. Then Mrs. Travilla locked the door of the one that held the treasured relics of her departed mother, and carried away the key. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of Elsie's Motherhood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Elsie's Motherhood by Martha Finley. Chapter 25th. She'd lift the teapot lid to peep at what was in it, or tilt the kettle if you did, but turn your back in a minute. Meta Carrington had many excellent traits of character, was frank, generous, unselfish, and sincere, but these good qualities were offset by some very serious faults. She was prying and full of desire for whatever was forbidden. The other children played contentedly with the toys provided for them, but Meta secretly nursed a great longing for those Mrs. Travilla had chosen to withhold. She was constantly endeavoring to devise some plan by which to get possession of them. She attempted to pick the lock with a nail, then with a knife, but failing in that, seized every opportunity of doing so unobserved, to try the keys from other doors in different parts of the house, till at length she found one that would answer her purpose. Then she watched her chance to use it in the absence of her mates. At length such a time came. The ladies had all gone out for an airing, the little ones too, in charge of their nurses. Vi and the boys were sporting on the lawn, and Elsie was at the piano practising, certain, faithful little worker that she was, not to leave it till the allotted hour had expired. Having satisfied herself of all this, Meta flew to the playroom, and half trembling at her own temerity, admitted herself to the forbidden treasures. There was no hesitancy in regard to her further proceedings. For weeks past she had had them all carefully arranged in her mind. She would have a tea party, though unfortunately there could be no guests present but the dolls, yet at all events she could have the great pleasure of handling that beautiful china and silver, and seeing how a table would look set out with them, a pleasure doubled by the fact that she was enjoying it in opposition to the known wishes and commands of her mother and the owner, for in Meta's esteem stolen waters were sweet indeed. She selected a damask tablecloth from a pile that lay on one of the lower shelves, several napkins to match, slipping each of these last into a silver ring she had taken from a little basket that stood alongside, and proceeded with quiet glee to deck a table with them and the sets of china and silver she most admired. "Beautiful! Beautiful! I never saw anything so pretty!" she exclaimed half aloud as, her task finished, she stood gazing in rapt delight at the result of her labors. "Oh, I think it's real mean in Aunt Elsie to say we shan't play with these. and to lock them up away from us. But now for the company." And running into the closet again, she brought out several of the largest dolls. "I'll dress them for dinner," she said, still talking to herself in an undertone. "That'll be fun. What lots of lovely things I shall find in these trunks! I'll look them over and select what I like best to have them wear. I'll have time enough. It isn't at all likely anybody will come to disturb me for an hour." And as she opened the first trunk, she glanced hastily at the clock on the mantel. She was mistaken. Time flew away much faster than she was aware of, and scarce half an hour had passed when a pair of little feet came dancing along the hall. The door, which in her haste and preoccupation Meta had forgotten to lock, flew open, and Vi stood before her. The great blue eyes turning toward the table opened wide with astonishment. Why, Meta!" Meta's face flushed deeply for a moment, but thinking the best plan would be to brave it out. "Isn't it pretty?" she asked, as unconcernedly as she could. "Yes, oh lovely, but where did you aren't they my grandma's things? Oh, Meta, how could you ever dare?" "Pooh, I'm not going to hurt them. And why should you think they were hers? Can't other people have pretty things?" "Yes, but I know they're grandma's. I recognize them. Oh, what shall we do? I wouldn't venture to touch them, even to put them back." "What a big word that was you used just now," said Meta, laughing. "It most choked you." "Well, when I'm bigger it won't," returned Vi, still gazing at the table. "Oh, how lovely they are! I do wish mamma would let us play with them." "So do I, and these dolls too. It's just delightful to dress and undress them. Here, Vi, help me put this one's shoes on." The temptation to handle the tiny dainty shoes and see how well they fitted the feet of the pretty doll was great, and not giving herself time to think, Violet dropped down on the carpet by Meta's side and complied with the request. Just to slip on those lovely shoes, now that they were there right before her, that's not much, so said the tempter. Then, now having done a little, what difference if she did a little more? Thoughtless and excitable, she presently forgot mamma and her commands, and became as eagerly engaged as Meta herself in the fascinating deployment of looking over the contents of the trunks, and trying now one and now another suit upon the dollies. "Now this one's dressed, and I'll set her up at the table," said Meta, jumping up. "Oh my!" Something fell with a little crash on the lid of the trunk by Vi's side, and there at her feet lay one of the beautiful old china plates, broken into a dozen pieces. The child started up perfectly aghast, the whole extent of her delinquency flashing upon her in that instant. "Oh, what have I done? What a wicked, wicked girl I am! What will mamma say?" And she burst into an agony of grief and remorse. "You didn't do it, nor I either," said Meta, stooping to gather up the fragments. "The doll kicked it off. There, Vi, don't cry so. I'll put the things all back just as they were, and never, never touch one of them again." "But you can't, because this one's broken. Oh dear, I wish you had let them alone, Meta. I wish I had been a good girl and obeyed mamma." "Never mind. If she goes to whip you, I'll tell her it was most all my fault. But she needn't know. It won't be a story to put them back and say nothing about it. And most likely it won't be found out for years and years, maybe never. You see, I'll just put this plate between the others in the pile, and it won't be noticed at all that it's broken, unless somebody takes them all down to look." "But I must tell mamma," sobbed Violet. "I couldn't hide it. I always tell her everything, and I'd feel so wicked." "Violet Travilla, I'd never have believed you'd be so mean as to tell tales," remarked Meta severely. "I'd never have played with you if I'd known it." "I'll not. I didn't mean that. I'll only tell on myself." "But you can't do that without telling on me too, and I say it's real mean. I'll never tell a story about it, but I don't see any harm in just getting the things away and saying nothing. 'Tain't as if you were throwing the blame on somebody else," pursued Meta, gathering up the articles abstracted from the closet and replacing them as nearly as possible as she had found them. "Come, dry your eyes, Vi," she went on, "or somebody'll see you've been crying and ask what it was about." "But I must tell mamma," reiterated the little girl, sobbing anew. "And make her feel worried and sorry because the plate's broken, when it can't do any good and she needn't ever know about it. I call that real selfishness." This, to Vi, was a new view of the situation. She stopped crying to consider it. It certainly would grieve mamma to know that the plate was broken, and perhaps even more to hear of her child's disobedience, and if not told she would be spared all that pain. But on the other hand, mamma had always taught her children that wrong-doing should never be concealed. The longer Vi pondered the question, the more puzzled she grew. Meta perceived that she wavered and immediately seized her advantage. "Come now, Vi, I'm sure you don't want to give pain to your mamma, or get me into trouble, do you?" "No, Meta, indeed I don't, but—" "Hush! Somebody's coming!" exclaimed Meta, locking the closet door, having just finished her work, and hastily dropping the key into her pocket. "Come, girls, come quick! We're sending up a balloon from the lawn!" cried Eddie, throwing open the door to make his announcement, then rushing away again. The girls ran after him in much excitement, and forgetting for the time the trouble they were in, for spite of Meta's sophistry, her conscience was by no means easy. The ladies had returned, and in dinner dress were gathered on the veranda. Mr. Travilla seemed to be managing the affair, with Mr. Dinsmore's assistance, while the other gentlemen, children, and servants were grouped about them on the lawn. Meta and Violet took their places with the rest, and just at that moment the balloon, released from its fastenings, shot up in the air. There was a general shout and clapping of hands, but instantly hushed by a shrill, sharp cry of distress from overhead. "Oh, oh, pull it down again! Pull it down! Pull it down! I only got in for fun, and I'm so frightened I shall fall out! I shall be killed! Oh, oh, oh!" The voice grew fainter and fainter, till it quickly died away in the distance as the balloon rose rapidly higher and higher into the deep blue of the sky. A wild excitement seized upon the little crowd. "Oh, oh, oh! Which of de chillens am up dar?" the mummies were asking, each sending a hasty glance around the throng to assure herself of the safety of her own particular charge. "Who is it? Who is it?" asked the children, the little girls beginning to sob and cry. "Oh, it's Fank! It's Fank!" screamed Harold. "Papa, papa, please stop it quick! Fank, don't cry any more! Papa will get you down, won't you, papa?" And he clung to his father's arm, sobbing bitterly. "Son, Frank is not there," said Mr. Travilla, taking the little weeper in his arms. "There is no one in the balloon. It is not big enough to hold even a little boy like you or Frank." "Isn't it, papa?" returned the child, dropping his head on his father's shoulder with a sigh of relief. "Oh, it's Cousin Ronald! It's just Cousin Ronald!" exclaimed the children, their tears changing at once to laughter. Yeah, so it is, Ben is. Just Cousin Ronald at his old tricks again," laughed Mr. Lilburn. "Oh, there's nobody in it, so we needn't care how high it goes," cried Eddie, jumping and clapping his hands. "See, see, it's up in the clouds now, and it doesn't look as big as my cap." "Not half so big, I should say," remarked Herbert. "And there, it's quite gone." The dinner bell rang, and all repaired to the dining room. End of Chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of Elsie's Motherhood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Elsie's Motherhood by Martha Finley. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it. Proverbs 22:6. As naturally as the helianthus to the sun, did the faces of Elsie's little ones turn to her when in her loved presence. At the table, at their sports, their lessons, everywhere, and however employed, it was always the same, the young eyes turning ever and anon to catch the tender, sympathetic glance of mamma's. But at dinner today, Vi's great blue orbs met hers but once, and instantly dropped upon her plate again, while a vivid blush suffused the fair face and neck. And when the meal was ended, and all gathered in the drawing room, Vi still seemed to be unlike her usual gay, sunny self, the merriest prattler of all the little crowd of children, the one whose sweet silvery laugh rang out the oftenest. She stood alone, at a side table turning over some engravings, but evidently with very little interest. The mother, engaged in conversation with the other ladies, watched her furtively, a little troubled and anxious, yet deeming it best to wait for a voluntary confidence on the part of her child. Longing, yet dreading to make it, Vi was again puzzling her young brain with the question whether Meta was right in saying it would be selfish to do so. Ah, if she could only ask Mamma which was the right way to do! It was the first perplexity she had not been able to carry to her for disentanglement. Remembering the words of the Lord Jesus, "Sanctify them through thy truth, thy word is truth," Elsie had been careful to store her children's minds with the blessed teaching and precious promises of God's holy book. She had also taught them to go to God their Heavenly Father with every care, sorrow, doubt, and difficulty. "I'll ask Jesus," thought Vi. "He'll help me to know, because the Bible says, 'If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him.'" She slipped into an adjoining room where she was quite alone, and kneeling down, whispered softly, with low sobs and many tears, "Dear Father in heaven, I've been a very, very naughty girl. I've disobeyed my dear mamma. Please forgive me for Jesus' sake, and make me good. Please, Lord Jesus, help me to know if I ought to tell mamma." A text, one of the many she had learned to recite to her mother in that precious morning half hour, came to her mind as she arose from her knees. "He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy." "I did not cover them," she said to herself. "I told God. But then God knew all about it before. He sees and knows everything, but mamma does not know. Perhaps it means I mustn't cover them from her. I think Jesus did tell me." Wiping away her tears, she went back to the drawing room. The gentlemen were just leaving it, her father among the rest. A sudden resolution seized her and she ran after them. "Papa!" He turned at the sound of her voice. "Well, daughter?" I want to ask you something." "Another time, then, pet. Papa's in a hurry now." But seeing the distress in the dear little face, he came to her, and laying his hand on her head in tender fatherly fashion, said, "Tell Papa what is it that troubles you. I will wait to hear it now." "Papa," she said, choking down a sob, I don't know what to do." "About what, daughter?" "Papa, suppose I've done something naughty, and it would grieve dear mamma to hear it. Ought I to tell her and make her sorry?" "My dear little daughter," he said, bending down to look with grave, tender eyes into the troubled face, "never, never conceal anything from your mother. It is not safe for you, pet, for she would far rather bear the pain of knowing. If our children knew how very much we both love them, they would never want to hide anything from us." "Papa, I don't. But somebody says it would be selfish to hurt mamma so." "The selfishness was in doing the naughty thing, not in confessing it. Go, my child, and tell mamma all about it." He hastened away, and Violet crept back to the drawing room. The other children were leaving it. "Come, Vi," they said, "we're going for a walk." "Thank you, I don't wish to go this time," she answered with gravity. "I've something to attend to." "What a grown-up way of talking you have, you little midget," laughed Meta, then putting her lips closer to Vi's ear. "Violet Travilla," she whispered, "don't you tell tales, or I'll never, never play with you again as long as I live." "Mamma says it's wicked to say that," returned Vi, "and I don't tell tales." Then as Meta ran away, Violet drew near her mother's chair. Mamma was talking, so she must not interrupt. So she waited, longing to have the confession over, yet feeling her courage almost fail with the delay. Elsie saw it all, and at length seized an opportunity, while the rest were conversing among themselves, to take Vi's hand and draw her aside. "I think my little girl has something to say to mother," she whispered softly, smoothing back the clustered curls, and looking tenderly into the tear-stained face. Violet nodded assent. Her heart was so full, she could not have spoken a word without bursting into tears and sobs. Mamma understood, and rose and led her from the room, led her to her own dressing-room, where they could be quite secure from intrusion. Then, seating herself and taking the child on her lap, "What is wrong with my dear little daughter?" she asked. "Oh, mamma, mamma, I'm so sorry, so sorry," cried the child, bursting into a passion of tears and sobs, putting her arms about her mother's neck and hiding her face on her breast. "Mamma is sorry, too, dear, sorry for anything that makes her Vi unhappy. What is it? What can mother do to comfort you?" "Mamma, I don't deserve for you to be so kind, and you will have to punish instead of comforting. But I just want to tell about my own self. You know I can't tell tales, mamma." "No, daughter, I do not ask or wish it, but tell me about yourself." "Mamma, it will make you sorry, ever so sorry." "Yes, dear, but I must bear it for your sake." "Oh, mamma, I don't like to make you sorry. I wish I hadn't been so naughty. Oh, so naughty, mamma. For I played with some of your mamma's things that you forbade us to touch, and one lovely plate got all broken up." "I am very sorry to hear that," returned the mother, yet far more grieved by my child's sin. "But how did you get the door open and the plates off the shelf?" "I didn't, mamma. They were out." "Someone else did it?" "Yes, mamma. But you know I can't tell tales. It wasn't any of our children, though none of them were naughty but just me." "Were you playing with the plate? Did you break it?" "No, mamma, I didn't touch the plates, but I was dressing one of the dollies. They are all locked up again now, mamma, and I don't think anybody will ever touch them any more." A little tender, serious talk about sin and danger of disobedience to parents, and the mother knelt with her child. In a few simple words asked God's forgiveness for her, then telling Vi she must remain alone in that room till bedtime, she left her. Not one harsh or angry word had been spoken, and the young heart was full of passionate love to her mother that made the thought of having grieved her a far bitterer punishment than the enforced solitude, though that was at any time irksome enough to one of Vi's social, fun-loving temperament. It cost the mother a pang to inflict the punishment and leave the darling alone in her trouble, but Elsie was not one to weakly yield to inclination when it came in conflict with duty. Hers was not selfish love. She would bear any present pain to secure the future welfare of her children. She rejoined her friends in the drawing-room, apparently as serenely happy as her wont. But through all the afternoon and evening her heart was with her little one in her banishment and grief, yearning over her with tenderest mother love. Little Elsie, too, missed her sister, and returning from her walk went in search of her. She found her at last in their mamma's dressing-room, seated at the window, her cheek resting on her hand, the tears coursing slowly down, while her eyes gazed longingly out over the beautiful fields and the lovely orange groves. "Oh, my own Vi, my darling little sister, what is the matter?" asked Elsie, clasping her in her arms and kissing the wet cheek. A burst of bitter sobs. while the small arms clung about the sister's neck, and the golden head rested for an instant on her shoulder. Then the words, I'd tell you, but I can't now, for you must run right away, because mamma said I must stay here all alone till bedtime." "Then I must go, pet, but don't cry so. If you've been naughty and are sorry, Jesus and mamma too will forgive you and love you just the same," Elsie said, kissing her again, then releasing her and hurried from the room, crying heartily in sympathy. On the upper veranda, whither she went to recover her composure before rejoining her mates, she found her mother pacing slowly to and fro. "Is my Elsie in trouble too?" Mrs. Travilla asked, pausing in her walk and holding out her hand. "For my Vi, mamma," sobbed Elsie, taking the hand and pressing it to her lips. "Yes, poor little pet, mother's heart aches for her too," Mrs. Travilla answered, her own eyes filling. "I am glad my little daughters love and sympathize with each other." "Mamma, I would rather stay with Vi than be with the others, may I?" "No, daughter, I have told her that she must spend the rest of the day alone." "Yes, mamma, she told me so, and wouldn't let me stay even 1 minute to hear about her trouble." "That was right." Time crept very slowly to Violet. She thought that afternoon the longest she had ever known. After a while she heard a familiar step, and almost before she knew it, Papa had her in his arms. With a little cry of joy, she put hers around his neck and returned the kiss he had given her. "Oh, I'm so glad," she said, "but Papa, you have to go away because nobody can stay with me. Papa May," he said, sitting down with her on his knee. "So you told mamma about the naughtiness?" "Yes, sir." "I'm glad you did. Always tell mamma everything. If you have disobeyed her, never delay a moment and go and confess it." "Yes, Papa, but if it's you, then come to me in the same way. I want you to be a happy child and have no concealment from father or mother." "Shall I tell you about it now, Papa? You may do as you like about that, since your mother knows it all." "Papa, I'm afraid you wouldn't love such a naughty girl any more." "Mamma loves you quite as well, and so shall I, because you are our own little daughter." There were tears in mamma's eyes when she told me that she had to punish our little Vi. "Oh, I'm so sorry to have made mamma cry," sobbed the child. "Sin always brings sorrow and suffering sooner or later, my little girl. Remember that. And that is because Jesus loves us, that He would save us from our sins." After a little more talk, in which Violet repeated to him the same story of her wrongdoing that she had already told her mother, her papa left her, and she was again alone till Mammy came with her supper, a bowl of rich sweet milk and bread from the unbolted flour, that she might have tempted the appetite of an epicure. "Come, honey, dry those wet eyes and eat your supper," said Mammy, setting it out daintily on the little table, which she had placed before the child and covered with a fine damask cloth, fresh from the iron. "De milk's all clean, and de bread good as can be, and you can have as much as you want of both dem." "Did mamma say so, Mammy?" "Yes, child, and don't shed no more tears now. Ole mammas loves you like her life." "But I've been very naughty, Mammy," sobbed the little girl. "Yes, Miss Little Honey, and we's all been naughty, but de good Lord forgive us for Jesus' sake if we's sorry and don't 'tend never to do so no more." "Yes, Mammy. Oh, I wish you could stay with me, but you mustn't, for mamma said I must be all alone." "Yes, darling, and if you wants more supper, just ring, and Mammy will come." She placed a small silver bell on the table beside Vi, and with a tender, compassionate look at the tear-swollen face went away. The young Travillas were sometimes denied dainties because of misconduct, but always allowed to satisfy their youthful appetites with an abundance of wholesome, nourishing food. Vi ate her supper with a keen relish, and found herself greatly comforted by it. How much one's views of life are brightened by a good comfortable meal that does not overtax the digestive organs! Vi suddenly remembered, with a feeling of relief, that the worst of her trouble, the confession, was over, and the punishment nearly so. It was only a little while till Mamma came, and took her on her lap and kissed her and forgave her. "Mamma, I'm so sorry for having disobeyed and grieved you," whispered the child, weeping afresh, "for I do love you very, very much, my own mamma." "I know it, dearest, but I want you to be far more sorry for having disobeyed God, who loves you more, a great deal, than your parents do, and has given you every good thing you have." "Yes, mamma, I've asked God many times to forgive me for Jesus' sake, and I think he has. Yes, if you have asked him with your heart, I am sure he has. For Jesus said, 'Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever shall ask the Father in my name, he will give it you.'" There was a little pause, Vi nestling close in her mother's arms. Then, with a quiver in her voice, "Mamma," she sighed, "will you ever trust me again?" "Just the same as before, my child, because I believe you are truly sorry for your sin against God and against me." "Thank you, dear, dear mamma. Oh, I hope God will help me to keep from ever being naughty any more." End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of Elsie's Motherhood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kay Hand. Elsie's Motherhood by Martha Finley. Chapter 27. Conscience makes cowards of us all. Meta was not in a cheerful or companionable mood during the walk that afternoon. The stings of conscience goaded her, and she was haunted by the fear that Violet, so young and innocent, so utterly unused to concealments, would betray her share in the mischief done, even without intending to do so. "Meta, what's the matter with you?" Herbert asked at length. "You haven't spoken a pleasant word since we came out." "I'm not ill," was the laconic reply. "Then you must be in the sulks, and ought to have stayed at home," returned the plain-spoken brother. "Oh, don't tease her," said little Elsie. "Perhaps she has a headache, and I know by myself that makes one feel dull and sometimes even cross." "You cross! I don't believe you ever were in your life," said Herbert. "I've never seen you anything but pleasant as a May morning." "Don't quarrel, children, but help me gather some of these lovely flowers to scatter over the graves up there on the hill," said Rosie Dinsmore. "Our graves," said Eddie softly. "Yes, I'd like to, but Aunt Rosie, I don't believe we can get in." "Yes, we can," she answered. "Uncle Joe's up there at work, weeding and trimming the rose bushes." "Then I'll gather plenty of these beauties," said Eddie, stooping to pluck the lovely many-hued blossoms that spangled the velvety grass at their feet in every direction. How beautiful they are, and some of them so fragrant!" exclaimed Elsie, rapidly filling a pretty basket she carried in her hand. "How good God is to give us so many lovely things." "Yes," returned Rosie, "it seems a pity to pluck them from their stems and make them wither and die, but there is such a profusion that what we take can hardly be missed." "And it's honoring our graves to scatter flowers over them, isn't it, Aunt Rosie?" Eddie asked. "Why do you say our graves, just as if you were already buried there?" laughed Herbert. "Come," said Rosie, "I think we have enough now." "Oh, Aunt Rosie, down in that little dell yonder they are still thicker than here, and more beautiful, I think," exclaimed Elsie. "But we have enough now. Your basket is full. We'll go to that dell as we come back, and gather some to take home to our mammas." "Oh yes, that will be best," Elsie said with cheerful acquiescence. "I shall go now and get some worthy to honor the dead," said Meta, starting off in the direction of the dell. "Meta likes to show her independence," said Rosie, smiling. "We won't wait for her." They climbed the hill, pushed open the gate of the little enclosure, and passed in, very quietly, for their youthful spirits were subdued by the solemn stillness of the place, and a feeling of awe crept over them at the thought of the dead whose dust lay sleeping there. Silently they scattered the flowers over each lowly resting place, reserving the most beautiful for that of her who was best known to them all, the first who had borne the name of Elsie Dinsmore. "Our dear grandma," whispered Elsie and Eddie softly. "I can't help feeling as if she was some relation to me too," said Rosie, "because she was my sister's mother and papa's wife." The breeze carried the words to the ear of Uncle Joe, who was at work on the farther side of the enclosure, and had not till that moment been aware of the vicinity of the young people. He rose and came hobbling toward them, pulling off his hat and bowing respectfully. "Dat's so, Miss Rosie, ef you lubs de Lord like she did, de dear young missus dat lays heah, for don't de apostle say ob de Lord's chillen dat dey's all one in Christ Jesus? All one, Miss Rosie, heirs ob God and joint heirs wid Christ." "Yes, Uncle Joe, that is true." "Ah, she was lubly and lubbed de master well," he went on, leaning upon his staff and gazing fixedly at the name engraved on the stone. "She's not dead, chillen. Her soul's wid de Lord in dat land ob light and glory, and de body planted heah till de morning ob de resurrection." "And then she will rise more beautiful than ever," said little Elsie. "Mamma has told me about it. The dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord," repeated Rosie. "Yes, Miss Rosie, breast hope," and Uncle Joe hobbled back to his work. "Here, look at these," said Meta, hurrying up, heated and out of breath with running. "Aren't they beauties?" She emptied her apron upon the grave as she spoke, then pulled out her handkerchief with a jerk to wipe the perspiration from her face. Something fell against the tombstone with a ringing metallic sound. "A key! A door key!" cried Herbert, stooping to pick it up. "Why, Meta, what key is it? And what are you doing with it?" "I never heard that it had any particular name," she answered tartly, snatching it from him and restoring it to her pocket, while her cheeks flushed crimson. The others exchanged surprised glances, but said nothing. "But what door does it belong to? And what are you doing with it?" persisted Herbert. "Talk of the curiosity of women and girls!" sneered Meta. "Men and boys have quite as much, but it's against my principles to gratify it." "Your principles!" laughed Herbert. "You, prying, meddling Meta, talking about other people's curiosity! Well, that's a good one." "You insulting boy, I'll tell mamma of you," retorted Meta, beginning to cry. "Ha, ha! I wish you would. Tell her my remarks about the key, and she'll soon make you explain where it belongs and how it came into your possession." At that Meta, deigning no reply, put her handkerchief to her eyes and hurried away toward the house. "There, she's gone to tell mamma," said Harry. "Not she," said Herbert. "She knows better. She'd only get reproved for telling tales, and be forced to tell all about that key. She's been at some mischief, I haven't a doubt. She's always prying and meddling with what she's been told not to touch. Mamma says it's her besetting sin." "And what does she say is yours?" asked Rosie, looking him steadily in the eye. Herbert colored and turned away. His mother had told him more than once or twice that he was quite too much disposed to domineer over and reprove his younger brothers and sisters. "Well, I don't care," he muttered to himself. "'Tisn't half so mean a fault as Meta's. I am the oldest, and Harry and the girls ought to be willing to let me tell them of it when they go wrong." The key, which belonged to a closet in Mr. Lilburn's dressing room, seemed to burn in Meta's pocket. She was frightened that Herbert and the others had seen it. "They all looked as if they knew something was wrong," she said to herself. "And to be sure, what business could I have with a door key? Dear me, why wasn't I more careful? But it's like, murder will out, or what the Bible says, be sure your sin will find you out." She was afraid to meet her mother with the key in her possession, so took a circuitous route to reach the house, and walked so slowly that the others were there some time before her. Her mother was on the veranda looking out for her. "Why, how late you are, Meta," she said. "Make haste to your room, and have your hair and dress made neat, for the tea bell will soon ring." "Yes, ma'am," and Meta flew into the house and up to her room, only too glad of an excuse for not stopping to be questioned. She was down again barely in time to take her seat at the table with the others. She glanced furtively at the faces of her mother, grandmother, and Aunt Elsie, and drew a sigh of relief as she perceived that they had evidently learned nothing yet of her misconduct. After tea she watched Mr. Lilburn's movements, and was glad to see him step into the library, seat himself before the fire, and take up a book. "He's safe to stay there for a while," she thought, "so fond of reading as he is," and ran up to her room for the key, which she had left there hidden under her pillow. She secured it unobserved, and stole cautiously to the door of his dressing room. She found it slightly ajar, pushed it a little wider open, crept in, gained the closet door, and was in the act of putting the key into the lock when a deep groan, coming from within the closet apparently, so startled her that she uttered a faint cry, and dropped the key on the floor. Then a hollow voice said, "If you ever touch that again, I'll—" But Meta waited to hear no more. Fear seemed to lend her wings, and she flew from the room in a panic of terror. "Aha! Aha! Aha! You were at some mischief, no doubt, my lassie. The wicked flee when no man pursueth, the good book tells us," said the occupant of the room, stepping out from the shadow of the window curtain. He had laid down his book almost immediately, remembering that he had some letters to write, and had come up to his apartments in search of one he wished to answer. It was already dark, except for the light of a young moon, but by some oversight of the servants the lamps had not yet been lighted here. He was feeling about for matches, when, hearing approaching footsteps, he stepped behind the curtain and waited to see who the intruder was. He recognized Meta's form and movements, and sure that no legitimate errand had brought her there at that time, resolved to give her a fright. Tearing down the hall, Meta suddenly encountered her mother, who, coming up to her own apartments, had reached the head of the stairs just in time to witness Meta's exit from those of Mr. Lilburn. "Oh, I'm so frightened, mamma," said the child, throwing herself into her mother's arms. "As you richly deserve to be," said Mrs. Carrington, taking her by the hand and leading her into her dressing room. "What were you doing in Mr. Lilburn's apartments?" Meta hung her head in silence. "Speak, Meta, I will have an answer," her mother said with determination. "I wasn't doing any harm, only putting away something that belonged there." "What was it?" "A key." "Meddling again! Prying even into the affairs of a strange gentleman," groaned her mother. "Meta, what am I to do with you? This dreadful fault of yours mortifies me beyond everything. I feel like taking you back to Ashlands at once, and never allowing you to go from home at all, lest you should bring a lifelong disgrace upon yourself and me." "Mother, I wasn't prying or meddling with Mr. Lilburn's affairs," said Meta, bursting into sobs and tears. "What were you doing there? Tell me all about it without any more ado." Knowing that her mother was a determined woman, and seeing that there was now no escape from a full confession, Meta made it. Mrs. Carrington was much distressed. "Meta, you have robbed your Aunt Elsie, who has always been so good, so kind to me and to you, and I can never make good her loss, never replace that plate." "Just that one tiny plate couldn't be worth so very much," muttered the offender. "Its intrinsic value was perhaps not very great," replied Mrs. Carrington, "but to my dear friend it was worth much as a memento of her dead mother. Meta, you shall not go with us to morrow, but shall spend the day locked up in your own room at home." An excursion had been planned for the next day, in which the whole party, adults and children, were to have a share. They were to leave at an early hour in the morning, travel several miles by boat, and spend the day picnicking on a deserted plantation, one Meta had not yet seen, but had heard spoken of as a very lovely place. She had set her heart on going, and this decree of her mother came upon her as a great blow. She was very fond of being on the water, and of seeing new places, and had pictured to herself the delights of roaming over the large old house which she had heard was still standing, peeping into the closets, pulling open drawers, perhaps discovering secret stairways, and oh, delightful thought, possibly coming upon some hidden treasure forgotten by the owners in their hasty flight. She wept bitterly, coaxed, pleaded, and made fair promises for the future, but all in vain. Her mother was firm. "You must stay at home, Meta," she said. "It grieves me to deprive you of so great a pleasure, but I must do what I can to help you overcome this dreadful fault. You have chosen stolen pleasures at the expense of disobedience to me, and most ungrateful, wicked behavior toward my kind friend, and as a just and necessary punishment you must be deprived of the share you were to have had in the innocent enjoyments planned for tomorrow. You shall also make a full confession to your Aunt Elsie and ask her forgiveness." "I won't!" exclaimed Meta angrily. Then, catching the look of pained surprise in her mother's face, she ran to her and throwing her arms about her neck, "Oh, mamma, mamma, forgive me!" she cried. "I can't bear to see you look so grieved. I will never say that again. I will do whatever you bid me." Mrs. Carrington kissed her child in silence, then taking her by the hand, "Come and let us have this painful business over," she said, and led the way to Mrs. Travilla's boudoir. Elsie had no reproaches for Meta, but kindly forgave her, and even requested that she might be permitted to share in the morrow's enjoyment, but Mrs. Carrington would not hear of it. Chapter 28
of Elsie's Motherhood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Elsie's Motherhood by Martha Finley. Chapter 28. Mature I'll court in her sequestered haunts, by mountain, meadow, streamlet, grove or cell. Smollett. Mr. Dinsmore was pacing the front veranda, enjoying the cool, fresh morning air, when little feet came pattering through the hall, and a sweet child voice hailed him with, "Good morning, my dear grandpa." "Ah, grandpa's little cricket, where were you last evening?" he asked, sitting down and taking her on his knee. It was his pet name for Vi, because she was so merry. The fair face flushed, but putting her arms about his neck, her lips to his ear, "I was in mamma's dressing-room, grandpa," she whispered. "I was 'bliged to stay there, 'cause I'd been naughty and disobeyed mamma." "Ah, I am sorry to hear that, but I hope you don't intend to disobey any more." "No, indeed, grandpa." "Are you considered good enough to go with us to-day?" "Yes, grandpa. Mamma says I was punished yesterday, and I don't be punished twice for the same thing." "Mamma is quite right," he said, "and grandpa is very glad she allows you to go." "I don't think I deserve it, grandpa, but she's such a dear, kind mamma." "So she is, pet, and I hope you will always be a dear good daughter to her," said grandpa, holding the little face close to his. Meta was not allowed to come down for breakfast. Vi missed her from the table, and at prayers, and going up to Mrs. Carrington, asked, "Is Meta sick, Aunt Sophie?" "No, dear, but she has been too naughty to be with us. I have said she must stay in her own room all day." "And not go to the picnic? Oh, please let her go, auntie." The other children joined their entreaties to Vi's, but without avail, and with streaming eyes Meta at her window saw the embarkation, and watched the boats glide away till lost to view in the distance. "Too bad," she sobbed. "It's too bad that I must stay here and learn long, hard lessons, while all the rest are having such a good time." Then she thought remorsefully of her mother's sad look, as she bade her good-bye and said how sorry she was to be obliged to leave her behind, and as some atonement set to work diligently at her tasks. The weather was very fine, the sun shone, the birds filled the air with melody, and a delicious breeze danced in the tree-tops, rippled the water, and played with the brown and golden ringlets of little Elsie and Vi, and the flaxen curls of Daisy Carrington. The combined influences of the clear, pure air, the pleasant motion, as the rowers bent to their oars, and the lovely scenery meeting the eye at every turn, were not to be resisted, and all, young and old, were soon in gayest spirits. They sang songs, cracked jokes, told anecdotes, and were altogether a very merry company. After a delightful row of 2 hours or more, the rounding of a point brought suddenly into view the place of their destination. The boats were made fast and the party stepped ashore, followed by the men servants bearing rugs and wraps and several large, well-filled hampers of provisions. With joyous shouts the children ran hither and thither, the boys tumbled on the grass, the girls gathered great bouquets of the beautiful flowers, twisted them in their curls, and wore garlands for their hats. "Walk up to de house, ladies and gentlemen. Massa and missus not at home now, but be berry glad to see you when dey gets back," said a pleasant voice close at hand. All but Mr. Lilburn looked about for the speaker, wondered at seeing no one, then laughed at themselves for being so often and so easily deceived. "Suppose we accept the invitation," said Mr. Travilla, leading the way. The two old ladies preferred a seat under a wide spreading tree on the lawn, but the others accompanied him in a tour of the deserted mansion already falling rapidly to decay. They climbed the creaking stairs, passed along the silent corridors, looked into the empty rooms and out of the broken windows upon the flower gardens, once trim and gay, now choked with rubbish and overgrown with weeds, and sighed over the desolations of war. Plenty of dry branches strewed the ground in a bit of woods but a few rods distant. Some of these were quickly gathered, and a brightly blazing fire presently crackled upon the hearth and roared up the wide chimney. Leaving the house, which in its loneliness and dilapidation inspired only feelings of sadness and gloom, our party wandered over the grounds, still beautiful even in their forlornly neglected state. The domain was extensive, and the older boys, having taken an opposite direction from their parents, were presently out of their sight and hearing, the house being directly between. Uncle Joe, however, was with the lads, so no anxiety was felt for their safety. Wandering on, they came to a stream of limpid water flowing between high grassy banks, and spanned by a little rustic bridge. "Let's cross over," said Herbert. "That's such a pretty bridge, and it looks lovely on the other side." "No, no, 'tain't safe, boys. Don't you go for to try it," exclaimed Uncle Joe. "Pooh! What do you know about it?" returned Herbert, who always had great confidence in his own opinion. "If it won't bear us all at once, it certainly will one at a time. What do you say, Ed?" "I think Uncle Joe can judge better whether it's safe than little boys like us." "Don't you believe it. His eyes are getting old, and he can't see half so well as you or I." "I can see dat some of de planks is gone, Mas' Herbert, and de old timbers looks shaky." "Shaky! Nonsense! They'll not shake under my weight, and I'm going to cross." "Now, Herbie, don't you do it," said his brother. "You know mamma wouldn't allow it if she was here." "'Twon't be disobedience, though, as she isn't here and never has forbidden me to go on that bridge," persisted Herbert. "Mamma and papa say that truly obedient children don't do what their parents would forbid if they were present," said Eddie. "I say nobody but a coward would be afraid to venture on that bridge," said Herbert, ignoring Eddie's last remark. "Suppose it should break and let you fall, the worst would be a ducking." "De water's deep, Mas' Herbert, and you might git drownded," said Uncle Joe. "Or maybe some of dem timbers fall on you and break your leg or your back." They were now close to the bridge. "It's very high up above the water," said Harry, "and a good many boards are off. I'd be afraid to go on it." "Coward!" sneered his brother. "Are you afraid too, Ed?" "Yes, I'm afraid to disobey my father, because that's disobeying God." "Did your father ever say a word about not going on this bridge?" "No, but he's told me never to run into danger needlessly. That is when there's nothing to be gained by it for myself or anybody else." "Before I'd be such a coward," muttered Herbert, deliberately walking on to the bridge. The other two boys watched his movements in trembling, breathless silence, while Uncle Joe began looking about for some means of rescue in case of accident. Herbert picked his way carefully over the half-rotten timbers till he had gained the middle of the bridge, then stopped, looked back at his companions, and pulling off his cap, waved it around his head. "Hooray! Here I am! Who's afraid? Who was right this time?" Then, leaning over the low railing, "Oh!" he cried, "you ought just to see the fish! Splendid big fellows! Come on, boys, and look at 'em!" But at that instant the treacherous railing gave way with a loud crack, and with a wild scream for help, over he went, head foremost, falling with a sudden plunge into the water and disappearing at once beneath the surface. "Oh, he'll drown! He'll drown!" shrieked Harry, wringing his hands, while Eddie echoed the cry for help. "Run to de house, Marse Ed, and fetch some ob de boys to get him out," said Uncle Joe, hurrying to the edge of the stream with an old fishing rod he had found lying among the weeds on its bank. But a dark object sprang past him, plunged into the stream, and as Herbert rose to the surface, seized him by the coat collar, and so holding his head above water, swam with him to the shore. "Good Bruno! Brave fellow! Good dog!" said a voice near at hand, and turning to look for the speaker, Uncle Joe found Mr. Daly standing by his side. Leaving his gayer companions, the minister had wandered away, book in hand, to this sequestered spot. Together he and Uncle Joe assisted the dog to drag Herbert up the bank, and laid him on the grass. The fall had stunned the boy, but now consciousness returned. "I'm not hurt," he said, opening his eyes, "but don't tell mother. She'll be frightened half to death." "We'll save her as much as we can, and I hope you've learned a lesson, young sir, and will not be so foolhardy another time," said Mr. Daly. "P'raps he'll tink old folks not such fools next time," remarked Uncle Joe. "Bless de Lord dat he didn't get drownded." The men and boys came running from the house, bringing cloaks and shawls to wrap about the dripping boy. They would have carried him back with them, but he stoutly resisted, declaring himself quite as able to walk as anybody. "Let him do so. The exercise will help to prevent his taking cold, provided he is well wrapped up," said Mr. Daly, throwing a cloak over the lad's shoulders and folding it carefully about him. "Ill news flies fast," says the proverb. Mrs. Carrington met them upon the threshold, pale and trembling with affright. She clasped her boy in her arms with a heart too full for utterance. "Never mind, mother," he said. "I've only taken a ducking, that's all." "But it may not be all. You may get your death of cold," she said. "I've no dry clothes for you here." By this time the whole party had hurried to the spot. "Here's a good fire. Suppose we hang him up to dry before it," said old Mr. Dinsmore with a grim smile. "His clothes, rather, rolling him up in cloaks and shawls in the meantime," suggested Herbert's grandmother. "Let us ladies go back to the lawn and leave his uncle to oversee the business." Herbert had spoiled his holiday so far as the remainder of the visit to this old estate was concerned. He could not join the others at the feast presently spread under the trees on the lawn, or in the sports that followed, but had to pass the time lying idly on a pallet beside the fire, with nothing to entertain him but his own thoughts, and watching the servants, until, their work done, they too wandered away in search of amusement. Most of the afternoon was spent by the gentlemen in fishing in that same stream into which Herbert's folly and self-conceit had plunged him. Eddie had his own little fishing rod, and with it in his hand sat on a log beside his father, a little apart from the rest, patiently waiting for the fish to bite. Mr. Travilla had thrown several out upon the grass, but Eddie's bait did not seem to attract a single one. He began to grow weary of sitting still and silent, and creeping closer to his father, whispered, "Papa, I'm tired, and I want to ask you something. Do you think the fish will hear if I speak low?" "Perhaps not. You may try it if you like," returned Mr. Travilla, looking somewhat amused. "Thank you, papa. Well, Herbert said nobody but a coward would be afraid to go on that bridge. Do you think he was right, papa?" "No, my boy. But if you had gone upon it to avoid being laughed at, or called a coward, I should say you showed a great lack of true courage. He is a brave man or boy who dares to do right without regard to consequences." "But, papa, if you'd been there, and said I might if I wanted to." Hardly a supposable case, my son." "Well, if I'd been a man and could do as I chose—" "Men have no more right to do as they please than boys. They must obey God. If His will is theirs, they may do as they please, just as you may if it is your pleasure to be good and obedient." "Papa, I don't understand. Does God say we must not go into dangerous places?" "He says, 'Thou shalt not kill.' We have no right to kill ourselves, or to run the risk of doing so merely for amusement, or to be considered brave or dexterous." "But if somebody needs us to do it to save them from being hurt or killed, papa?" "Then it becomes quite a different matter. It is brave, generous, and right to risk our own life or limbs to save those of others." "Then I may do it, papa?" "Yes, my son. Jesus laid down His life to save others, and in all things He is to be our example." A hand was laid lightly on the shoulder of each, and a sweet voice said, "May my boy heed his father's instructions in this and in everything else." "Wife!" Mr. Travilla said, turning to look up in the fair face bent over them. "Mamma, dear mamma, I do mean to," said Eddie. "Is it not time to go home?" she asked. "The little ones are growing weary." "Yes, the sun is getting low." In a few moments the whole party had re-embarked, in less exuberant spirits than in the morning, yet perhaps not less happy; less disposed to talk, but with hearts filled with a quiet, peaceful content. Viamede was reached without incident, a bountiful supper awaiting them there partaken of with keen appetites, and the little ones went gladly to bed. Returning from the nursery to the drawing–room, Elsie found her namesake daughter sitting apart in a bay window, silently gazing out over the beautiful landscape sleeping in the moonlight. She looked up with a smile as her mother took a seat by her side, and passed an arm about her waist. "Isn't it lovely, mamma? See how the waters of our lakelet shine in the moonbeams like molten silver. And the fields, the groves, the hills, how charming they look in the soft light." "Yes, darling, and that was what you were thinking of, sitting here alone?" "Yes, mamma, and of how good God is to give us this lovely home, and dear, kind father and mother to take care of us. It is always so sweet to come back to my home when I've been away. I was enjoying it all the way coming in the boat to–night. That, and thinking of the glad time when we shall all be gathered into the lovelier home Jesus is preparing for us." "God grant we may," said the mother with emotion. "It's my heart's desire and prayer to God for all my dear ones, especially my children. 'Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man, the things which God hath prepared for them that love Him.'" End of Chapter 28. End of Elsie's Motherhood, by Martha Finley.